earlier this year, we launched Operations Nation with a mission to create a space for operations people. So a space for ops people just like you. Because I know from the survey from the RSVPs that you have completed in Eventbrite that majority of you are in operations with finance as one of your functions. And so we wanted to create that space and make sure that ops people can not only survive but thrive, no matter which stage they are at their careers. And it is a very hefty task. It's very, very, very tough because, as you know, operations can be so many different things. But we needed to pick something. We needed to start somewhere, and we thought that finance is quite a good choice because probably at some stage of operations careers, you will have to look after it to some extent at least. And finance is also something that you don't want to mess up. I certainly don't want to mess it up, and I'm at the moment looking after it in my organization. And I also know that at some point I will need to hire that finance team who actually know much better than I do what they would be doing. So with that in mind, we decided to go for it. And because it's such a big topic, we launched a whole series of events. And we had 5 events so far. And you can watch all the recordings on YouTube if you look for Operations Nation there. And one special person that I want to thank is Juvern from Quantico. Quantico is our event and content partner, and they're doing something really, really great. They're reinventing the finance function, I guess, when it comes to startups, and a lot of startups are already relying on Quantico when it comes to their finance teams. They are running themselves, and Jufern, you can correct me if I'm wrong, as on-demand FinOps experts, and you provide so many amazing services to startups and scale-ups, and really allow them to expand their team as they grow. And I guess we will kind of cover that in the panel tonight as well. These are all our amazing speakers tonight.
Oh, great. Thanks, Ozrina. Thanks for the intro. So to kind of, before we even start, I thought it would be good as well for each of the panelists to introduce themselves. Given that Taz obviously didn't have a picture on the slides, I thought maybe we'll let you kick off the discussion first. And just a quick introduction before we move on to the rest of the panelists, before we kind of start with some of the questions I already prepared. So go for it, Taz.
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, thanks very much for having me. Thank you to Ozrina. I used to work with Ozrina at Dice, was the VP of Finance there. We sort of kind of involved in that journey of growing it from, we were some 50 people and no finance team to 150 people, 55 people, finance team of 8, plus strategy, plus operations. We scaled from 2 countries at the time to 7, 11 cities, raised 40-some million along the way. And yeah, hopefully maybe in all of that journey, there might be something helpful for some other people to hear about.
Great, thanks for that. And Julie, what about a quick intro from yourself?
Yes, I'm Julie. I'm the finance director at WeGift. So we're about Series A level, 40 people, and the finance team is around 7, 8 soon. Finance and operations. So actually, I'm the inverse, looking after the upside of the company. So I was at Monzo for a couple of years before this, and we went in finance from 3 to about 40 people, and then joined WeGift early this year. So yeah, again, also hopefully I've got some little tips that I can help share with people along the way.
Great, and Roshni.
Hi, I'm Roshni. So currently I am doing finance and ops at Karakuri. I've been there probably about for 2 years. We had a really big seed round. We just applied for the Future Fund. Before that, I was at another startup. We went from 1 company to 16 companies to then 4 companies. So we went from like a finance team of 2 to about 8 around the world. And then before that, I was at Universal Music, which big corporate. So the finance team was endless. But yeah, hopefully I can help on both sides.
Great, thanks very much. So yeah, so before we kind of start with more kind of specific questions, I guess, I thought we'd start at a much higher level, I suppose. I'll kind of be quite interested to hear from your experiences, because like, it looks like all of us here have kind of worked, with startups at kind of different stages as well. How has it changed, I guess? So like, Julie, kind of picking up what you've said, like, how did things change from being finance team member number 4 to then being one of 40 people? Like, what worked really well and then what stopped working really well, and how do you iterate it across that?
Yeah, so I'd say one of the things I think did work really well in the early stages was hiring people who probably do have some level of expertise. Like within finance, there's lots of different specialist areas, right? So you can have financial controls and reporting, or more FP&A and strategy, or just tax, and as a bank, regulatory reporting as well. But I think starting with the core responsibilities that you need, and having people that are generalists enough, but with maybe a particular strength that is important based on the industry you're in. So whether that's more on like the financial control side or maybe commercial side. And then obviously as you get bigger, it is about getting people that are heavily specialist. So we probably had our head of tax come in as, I think maybe about the 10th person. And it was getting to the stage where, the general knowledge that you have within the team and the use of external consultants was getting too expensive. And then it makes sense to start hiring someone who's specialist there. And I'd say the other thing about the leveling as well was getting people that are probably at least mid-level to senior, but obviously willing to roll up their sleeves and do any kind of work. So someone who can kind of know enough, is experienced enough to recognize that there's an issue, even if they don't know how to solve it. Yeah, I'd say that was quite important.
Definitely. Actually, I quite like how you picked out on the, like, basically drawing out the fact that actually what you need at the start is a generalist, right? And then as the company gets bigger, there needs to be specialisms in, like, I guess, like in a bank as well. It's not just like tax, but I guess FCA regulation and all that sorts of things as well. So I guess, Tas, like from your experience at Dice, like, is that something you saw as well, like from that generalist route at the start? And actually also going back to what Julie said as well at the start as well, hiring someone at the mid-level, higher level, senior level, rather than saying hiring a junior person.
Yeah, so similar. Some small differences, I think, because we weren't in a regulated industry. But definitely I think one of the important things for me early was hiring a really, really good financial controller, actually, because depending on, I guess, the stage of the business, and actually importantly, the CEO, I think, plays a big role in this. If you can decouple finance from other functions, but if your CEO is going to need a lot of support with FP&A, with commercial, with strategy, if you're kind of in that sort of VP, financey, FD, CFO type role, the first hire, at least in my opinion, the most important hire that I made was a really fundamentally strong financial controller. And in terms of seniority, I think, yeah, financial controller, but always a sort of, you're never going to get the perfect one, I don't think. But just an expectation that everybody can rise above their experience. So even if you can't get a really good financial controller, you can probably get a very, very, very good management accountant, or like sort of senior management accountant. And generalist in the sense that fundamentally very sound. And then for expansion pieces, we made a point to hire local and specific knowledge in each of those markets. Like, I didn't need somebody who was technically very sharp at Spanish tax if I knew I could get a Spanish tax accountant outsourced.
Right. So going back to what you say, so the financial controller supported the CEO then, is that sort of like, and that's why you felt that that was the right decision to hire that very strong financial controller to support the CEO in the kind of analysis. And if there was a CEO who was strong in that, then there wouldn't be a need to hire an FC, or you could maybe get away with hiring someone more junior?
Not strictly to support the CEO, but more to support you so that you can free up almost all of your time to then support the CEO. So if you know that,
gotcha. Okay.
If you know that the controller can handle core finance, and you can dip in and out and do the FP&A strategy, commercial, corporate finance, things like that, then it for me, I found that was more important.
Fine. Sorry, I think I misunderstood you. I thought that the FC was the first finance hire. Rather, actually, you've been in place and it was hiring someone else to support you. Gotcha. Cool. And Roshni, from your experience as well, like, you mentioned about raising a really big seed round. Like, what happened just before and what happened after that definitely in terms of the finance team?
So I think when I joined here, there was no finance team sort of thing. So I was kind of hired pre-seed round to do all the financial modeling and things like that. And that's actually when they say that, right, you can do the CFO role, but the COO role. And so there's like, I have one person in my finance team currently, but that's, again, what Chaz was saying was that basically my CEO just wanted more of my time, and he didn't have enough time to kind of, you know, deal with the financial modeling, the operations side of it or whatever. So I think it's just at that startup level, pre-seed, it's just as long as your finance person is like totally hands-on and is willing to kind of do everything, I think, you know, that's really good. But back to what Chaz was saying about the FC, at my first startup that I started, there was an interim CFO who I think was there like 2 days a week. So what they needed was like an FD level, which I went in at. There was like a team, I think, of 4 people sort of thing. But as soon as, I guess, the CFO there realized that I was up to speed, within about 6 weeks, he kind of left. And so I kind of moved into that role, which I'd never done before. So, you know, like the CFO role. But yeah, I think if your FC is like super strong and is willing to do all the management reporting, the forecasting, the cash flow forecasting, it just gives you an FD or a CFO level a lot more time to go into like the strategic planning and help with fundraising and be more, I guess, out of face to investors.
Cool, excellent. And actually, I was quite keen as well because I know you've come from like larger corporates like Universal Music, for example. How is it different, like work finance team in a corporate versus a finance team in a startup?
I think just what Julie was saying, right? We had, I mean, the finance team was huge, so I kind of looked after supply chain, which is international. So I kind of had 400 people in my business, but we reported into like the FP&A team, which would do every single business unit around the world. So I guess probably worldwide, I don't know, there were probably about 300 finance people, but obviously with an outsourced service to service centers in India as well as Eastern Europe. So, and South America we started. So then actually, when I wanted to go from that to a startup, I was asked that question, how are you going to deal with startup mentality if, you know, you've worked at a big corporate, you've got tax people to do, you've got everyone to kind of, you know, like at the end of a phone call. But I went back to, when I trained at a smaller accountancy firm. So I went back to kind of that, you know, that hands-on approach. So it was difficult moving into a startup because you kind of had to do everything, right? You had to go back to remembering how to do proper accounting. Like, I mean, you've always kind of done it before, but you kind of had other people to do your debits and credits, to do your balance sheet recs. But what I realized is that key is that cash is king, right? So you need to understand your balance sheet to be able to realize when your cash is coming in, when your cash is coming out. So that was the massive difference for me from corporate to startup, was that you kind of have to know everything, right? It's more of a business partnering role as well. Yeah, so you're working alongside the CEO rather than you've got about 2 people above you to kind of get to that level.
Cool, thanks for that. That actually takes us to the next question I wanted to cover really, which is around, and it's a question that a lot of people have been asking, it's around like, when is it the right time to hire as well? So perhaps, yeah, I mean, it's quite an opaque question. It's like, oh, like when's the right time? Like we talked a little bit about like who the first hire should be. And I think definitely a generalist, because obviously you don't need a head of tax if that's the first hire, and definitely someone mid-level or above. Like, what do you think if you had to kind of come up with fundamentals, like what do you think are like the attributes of like what the company looks like for them to be ready to hire a person? So to start with, Julie, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, so to be fair, I'm probably slightly different because I've always been in financial services. So you've always needed at least a CFO in there to get a banking license, for example. But I'd probably say the thought process is, you know, are you spending so much time and effort? And I'm assuming at this stage, a lot of people are outsourcing the function, even if it's a general bookkeeping, invoice processing kind of stuff. Are you spending so much time and effort keeping your outsourced people up to date that actually doesn't become worth it from a cost and time benefit view? So it probably makes sense to get at least one person in that looks after that and can take it in-house. Therefore, you save the cost of outsourcing. They actually know the business, so you're not like constantly training them up or keeping them up to date on changes. And then for the same price, you're probably getting more value really at that stage.
Taz, what do you think? When's the right time to hire? So I understand you joined Dice as the first
kind of just immediately more valuable pieces outside. And then also it's the right time, if it's not driven by your own time or the business demands, there can also be the investor mandate where they just insist on now the quality of the reporting that we get is just not what we need and how we need to see things. So you just need to hire someone, we don't care who, we don't necessarily care if it's an FD or a CFO, but someone who can just provide something better.
Yeah, I think that's a fair assessment. It's basically about like, can I be asked to do this? I guess from an ops person perspective, it's like there's making that cost benefit analysis. What do you think, Roshni? And I think you were the first finance hire as well, you said. Like, did you think that they hired you at the right time? Should you have been there a lot earlier?
I think it's weird. It's like, I should have probably been there at the beginning, pre-seed round, to kind of be like, what so actually did, I worked on a part-time basis. And because our seed round was so big, they said, okay, right, actually, can you continue and do all of this? And I think it's that, I guess in your first 12 months of your business, right? So actually the company had been there for about a year before, but they were just trying to fundraise. If you're just looking for someone who's doing, like transactional bookkeeping, you don't really want the numbers to like translate into actual meaningful like story. I always say like, even an Excel sheet is kind of data. If you want it to tell a story, what your investors want, you want a one pager, then you're going to need somebody who actually understands that difference between like, a bookkeeper, that step up from management accountant, to kind of do variance analysis to actually provide meaningful information, right? And I think the startup that I joined before, it was probably too late because I know they'd only been going for 7 months, but they'd grown pretty quickly. And then they started buying companies. So they didn't have the financial processes in place. Everything was a little bit broken. So you can't start buying things if your current foundation is broken. And so they're always playing catch up to kind of be like, right, let's see if we can get more finance people in, but they just hired a little bit too late. So I think it's so different, right? Because a lot of companies are like, right, once we get to 10 million in revenue, that's when we need a finance person, or before just before Series A. And I think it just depends on, the number of people that you have or what you're trying to do. If you're like having stable growth, then I don't think, you need to worry about a change. If your current process works, then you don't need to change it. But like with most startups, they want to grow faster, they want to keep growing. So yeah, I'd say definitely, if you're before Series A, definitely get a finance person in, sort of thing. Also, it depends on, like Taz said about your investors. I think a lot of people are like, if they've given you a lot of money, they're like, actually, we want proper reporting, right? And we're going to do next round proper due diligence. You need to make sure that your finance person kind of understands what is required for that.
Yeah, no, I think definitely. I think those are all really good points, basically around, I think, going back to what Julie had said about like understanding what the time, like the cost benefit analysis is from the person currently doing finance, because finance is a core function, really. Like you can't get away by not doing finance. There's, if not even producing management accounts, there's obviously compliance that needs to be done. So even if you did have a finance team in place, you would have to have, at the very least, an accounting firm. And then kind of going back to, I think what you said, Roshni, about like, yeah, like you're right, like there's no like this 10 million mark, okay, get a finance team in place. It's never that clear cut, right? And I think I like what you said. If things are not broken and if things are fairly stable, then yeah, you can get away with it. And if you don't need someone to translate your numbers, if it's just like put a bunch of stuff into Xero, get a report out of Xero and it kind of works, then you know what, actually that's probably fine. And you may not want to invest in the finance team yet. But generally speaking, from my experience anyway, a lot of startups tend to leave it way too late. I think the first people they would have obviously is your developers and your sales team and then your marketing team and maybe PR. And then suddenly it's like, oh, maybe finance. And then you would have ops obviously trying to do everything else at the same time. But like my experience so far, definitely growing startups, is that finance is like the one that is just considered to be a cost center, right? That is just not valuable until it becomes desperate, which is obviously not the case because it's so much more painful to fix things when actually it's much easier to go in and do things as they go along. Cool. What would be the next? So what about the level of seniority? So we've talked a little bit about this as well. So say you were to hire, your first finance hire as an ops person. I think we've kind of said that like mid-level rather than someone junior, right? Because you want someone to come in, problem solve without obviously taking up too much of your management time. But like, does that person have to come from a startup to understand startups? Does that person just need to have a really solid kind of, background, having worked in practice for like X number of years and has some experience? Like, so maybe I'll start with Taz. Like, what do you think?
Yeah, this is actually, I think, one of the most, for years in hiring these sorts of roles, I think where I've had so many sort of different changes in mentality and thought process about it. If we go back to bigger companies, for example, hiring there is very sort of snobbish about, oh, they've got to be big four and they've got to have this and they've got to have that. And then kind of through this evolution of kind of consumer startups and all the chaos in between, it kind of basically my core thesis on hiring these roles, just very quickly, is basically I truly believe that everyone rises above their experience, especially when they're compelled to. And so if you're going to hire a very smart, talented individual, I just genuinely believe that they will do that. And I don't mean that, yeah, they're big four or they've got all these sort of blue chip brand names on their CV. If they're an ACA, I don't care where they got it from. Like, how well did they do in terms of like where did they place in their class, or like these sorts of things like that. I find more important. As you're growing and as you're scaling. So if we take Dice as the example, for the financial control hire, very important that I didn't care whether they had, if they were big four or not, but I did care that they had some experience of just high growth chaos, and whether that was a startup or whether that was a division of a particular larger company, I wasn't that bothered, because I think if we've all worked in big companies, we know that even perhaps at Universal, things don't work as well as they maybe allude to them working, right? So I don't know, does that answer your question, Julian? I'm not sure if that answers the question.
No, I think so. I think basically what you're saying is that like actually, because like the question here is like, what's the level of experience, right? So I think you basically say that like it's less about kind of like whether they've come from a big four, or like an established accounting firm, but more of the fact that they have worked in like that really chaotic environment, like you said. Because it is true, it is so different. Like working in the corporate, when like things work and like generally speaking, like you can get away with a little bit inefficient because things kind of work, right? But having said that though, I guess from a contrarian view, I guess, because Roshni, obviously you kind of joined the kind of chaotic startup world. And I think Julie as well, like you obviously kind of joined the chaotic startup world of having worked at Macquarie for a bit. So perhaps to start with Roshni, like how did you find that? Like, did you feel that you were disadvantaged or was it fine?
I didn't feel disadvantaged. I did feel though that basically going from Universal, where I said that, you know what, I think a lot of the stuff I could delegate to lots of people to sort of do, pick up a phone and be like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. And then going to this stuff, I mean, this startup that I joined was absolutely chaotic. Like, I remember the CFO who was there at the time after he left, I was like, I can't do this. I'm going to quit every day sort of thing. I think it's a different sort of thing because it's, that running out of cash at a big company. Cash, they don't really care about cash because it seems to come in like abundance, right? But for a startup, that is something that you're basically like, you're dependent on that, right? And it'd be like next month, can't pay the employees sort of thing. So it was a different sort of chaos, but also a different responsibility because you feel that responsibility on your shoulders, right? So it was like hit the ground running sort of thing. But like Taz was saying, if you hire the right person who kind of like thrives on that, right? And you don't want somebody who is, I don't know, has 15 years experience as a CFO because you know that they're not going to kind of like get their hands sort of dirty and roll their sleeves up, but like somebody who is like, I don't know, maybe senior management accountant wants to step into that next role and is there to kind of like prove their next steps. They're just gonna, you know, they're gonna be super enthusiastic, and yeah, they're gonna want to learn lots of different things. And I think that's one thing in Universal. I knew a lot of stuff, but I didn't know everything. Whereas in startup, finance kind of knows everything because you make it your business to know everything. Yeah, so no, I thought it was great, and I'd never go back to kind of like a corporate world. So I think it's, you know, it was super exciting, and it's definitely, if somebody wants to do it, then they'll be happy to do everything. You just need someone who's enthusiastic.
Yeah, no, definitely. And that's actually quite hard to pick up on a CV for sure. And that's something I want to tackle a little bit later. So like Taz had looked at your CV at that point in time, probably would like, she's worked at Universal. So like, you know, her experience is a startup, but obviously you had the right attitude and mentality. So let's figure out, like, I'll be quite keen to hear your thoughts as well. How do you see, like, when you review CVs, and then also after reviewing CVs as well, how do you test for these attributes as well? But Julie, how's your experience been like working like corporate and then moving to startups?
So I think the corporate, so Macquarie Bank's an investment bank back in Australia, not so big here in UK, and I was in the finance department. And I think what that taught me is a lot of the foundational skills and a lot of discipline. So again, like WeGift is actually the first company I've been in which is not regulated. So I've, like, from a career standpoint, sort of grown up in a much more rigorous environment financially. Like, you're very aware of, you know, what might, you know, regulation, like where does regulation impact, and, you know, capital requirements. And like Roshni said, it's not really about cash. It's so much more about other metrics on your P&L and your balance sheet, which don't matter when you're in a startup. So I think that grounding was useful just from a general best practice and discipline view. And then moving to a startup, yeah, like everyone said, it's so much about the attitude of the person, because you can get someone who's got lots of startup experience. So of course, they can deal with the mess very easily. And then I think what you have to think about is, you know, what industry is your startup in and what are the risks around it? So if you are in fintech or something where there is a lot of financial activity going on, then it probably does matter a lot more to get somebody with that right industry experience and slightly more senior level, because again, yeah, if you're coming from bigger companies, you're not the one doing everything. And when you are the only finance person, it's okay to not know everything, but you need to be able to recognize what you don't know and where your company's risks are, and then be able to reach out to the experts to help fill the gaps for you. Because if you're the only finance person, you know, sales and the CEO and product are obviously not thinking about the same risks that a finance person would. Yeah. And then potentially if you are in a more sort of simpler company from a financial view, like straightforward SaaS and like very minimal financial activity, it probably would be okay to have sort of a management accountant or like a very strong management accountant moving to manager level, because the complexity is less and there's more room for them to grow with the company, and there's less risk of having someone who just doesn't know. So again, it's not, it's just so much more, I think, about the industry experience and being aware of what you don't know, and having, it's hard to figure this out, but like, how do you spot someone who is smart enough to be able to recognize, I don't know something, but I can go out and find the answer. Like, I think that's a key skill. Yeah.
Yeah, no, definitely. I think, yeah, like you said, right, it's recognizing what you don't know, and then being kind of upfront about the fact that I don't know this, so I'm going to seek out external help. And that actually takes a lot of confidence as well. So like, how do you kind of spot that? Because like, there are also a lot of people who may not have that confidence, I suppose, at the more junior level, who might not kind of want to admit that because it might not look good, right? Just to take a step back, as this was a question that came up a lot as well. So because I think there's a few people in the audience, I guess, who are currently working with external accountants, because it makes sense when, you know, obviously there's compliance work that needs to be done. So at what point would you say, I mean, when does it make sense, I guess, to continue working with them? I know, Roshni, you said like when things are stable, for example. And actually, I think all of us would have worked with external accountants at some point as well. It may very well be that, like, even though you might manage a finance team right now, but you're also working with external accountants on specific bits. So just generally, like, how do you find the interaction between, yeah, like obviously the core finance team, the in-house finance team versus an external accountant, what you use them for, that sort of thing. Taz, why don't you kick us off?
We kind of had a little bit of an evolution with this, if I use DICE as the example. So we very, very quickly, so when I joined, we very quickly kind of rehoused all the external accountancy functions, just by virtue of, as Julie mentioned before, the time that you need to commit in getting them and getting the externals up to speed, because they're not in the business, they're not in the dashboards, not in the metrics, they're not in the all hands, they're not in all the commercials surrounding the business. But we effectively, what I would say is there is immense value in specialists, especially at a country level, in using external accountants. Like we would not have been able to launch in France without the domain specialist knowledge of our French external accountants, from taxes to governance to just all the things that you don't know to know about necessarily. So I think you need to balance between, it's kind of a bit of a trade-off between being prepared to sacrifice some of your own time in keeping them up to par and keeping them up to speed around the business, if it means you don't day to day have to think about the niches of that particular domain, for example. And then I think all of a sudden you find like the less accountants, they end up being more an extension of your team, and you can start introducing them into, or as we did, we would have, when we'd have our finance catch-ups with the team, we would just ask these guys to drop in occasionally every 2 weeks and just kind of keep the whole team abreast of what was going on. And by all means, they were an outsource, you know, they were an external. But I think when it works well, it works very, very well. You just need to be able to know, what can I do better? What can they do better? And in the early stages of a startup, when you come in with these sort of mid-seniorish hires, at least in the UK, just by extension of having all the expertise around the commercials, you can probably do that a little bit better than if it was outside.
Yeah, no, actually, I think you brought up a good point there about how, like, actually, it's also the responsibility of the team as well, the client, I guess, the company as well, to bring in, I guess, the specialists and to keep them in the loop. Because, like, I guess I come from the other side, I guess, at Quantico, whereby we obviously work with clients, and definitely the most effective relationships we have is when we are, you know, on the all hands, and we are like, when we just have a bit more business context about what's going on. And I think, unfortunately, like, when we've taken over from previous accounting firms, like, I think it's because the relationship just hasn't been able to, well, it just has been a very piecemeal kind of flow of information. It's like, do this. It's not like, by the way, we're actually expanding to this new country, or like there's this new revenue stream, which I think you said it's like so important if you want to make the best use of them, to keep them in a loop as well. Roshni, how do you work with current accountants now?
So I use accountants now mainly for my R&D tax credit, because obviously I've never had to do it before, but we're quite a heavy R&D company. And I find them really useful because of the fact is that, you know, you're loss making, so you want the cash, right?
Yep.
And that way is, again, it's back to that time equals money thing. They are experts at it, I'm not. So I could have spent ages trying to figure out what I can do, spent a lot of time like researching on the internet. And then obviously if I submit my R&D tax credit, and it could have come back and be like, actually, you haven't done this properly. So it delays the time. I could have made mistakes. Whereas these guys, you know, they don't charge you unless it's, you know, you've actually got physical money, the claim has been approved by HMRC, they deal with any queries or whatever. And I think for me, that's saved time, right? And I know that I'm definitely going to get a credit for it. And yeah, it's worth the money, just like, yeah. So I use them for that. I think filing accounts and things right now I'm fine with, but as the company grows and, you know, you want better tax planning if we decide to go into other countries. So the previous company, we're in 4 different countries, and I was like, I have no idea how the tax works in Australia, but it was also for little things like payroll, for example, in the US. That's absolutely crazy. So I'm just like, I need advice on this, and I think it's money worthwhile spent, basically.
Yeah, no, definitely. And it's the same theme there around specialists as well. Like, you know, actually where external accountants are really helpful is that specialism of the different tax areas, either different countries or more specialist tax areas in the UK as well. And Judy, how about you, and how's it been for like has it been different as well, like in Monzo and also like in WeGive now?
Yeah, so yeah, Monzo did have outsourced accounting. We used video, and was like, as things started to take off, it was quite important to have the people come on site with us, which I know you can't do now. But we had the people come sit with us during month end. They came to our all hands and all that kind of thing. So they kept relatively abreast of the business. I think it's also like clearly important to maintain clear expectations with whoever is managing, like the senior manager or the partner on your account as well. Like, if major things are changing, they might not be your day-to-day contact, but we try to have monthly calls with them and to keep them abreast so that they can plan proactively about the team as well. Like, things were growing so fast. Like when I started, we I think had like 2 days of video a week. And by the end, we needed someone, or basically 2 people were there half a month each, right? So just helping them prepare for what's going on so then they can manage their teams accordingly is really important. And then here at WeGift, the UK finance is all in-house, but same as others, we use people for our US and German operations because it is very specialized, very local, like your tax filings. Germany requires, you know, your financials to be set up in a very specific way. So it's just not worth it for us to do in-house. And you know, these are really like highly commoditized services as well. So they're quite cheap to do to make sure that you don't get a penalty or a fine. So yeah, echoing that, definitely worth it.
Yeah, definitely helps if you don't speak the language as well, I think.
Yes.
Cool. Okay, to shift gears slightly as well, I thought I'll be quite keen to hear like how you go about evaluating a candidate. So like, what tests have you got? How do you, so like Taz, you said that like what you're looking for is someone who's like, you know, who's comfortable working in a chaotic environment. So apart from obviously seeing someone's CV and seeing experience of working in a startup, how do you test for that? How do you know this is the right fit? How do you know this person's going to come in and like sort everything out? So maybe Taz, if you kind of start with that, like just about what test do you use as well, if you've got any tips on that?
Yeah. So so now the testing would actually vary kind of role to role. So let's say, okay, so this is maybe not. So for example, hiring a data analyst, for example, there's obviously a SQL test. So we kind of set a SQL task, but also if we knew that if the analyst in the initial interviews was quite insistent on being, you know, not just an analyst, but actually being kind of maybe towards like a strategy planning analyst, strategy planning manager type role. Simple, very kind of broad tasks. No right answer specifically, but more again about methodology of thought. How would you launch X product in Y market? And it could be specific to you, or it could be, because I think that can be a little bit unfair sometimes, but it could be something specific to something that they enjoy and something that they love, which I think then you get a real sense of passion towards project and passion towards product. For finance roles, it would be, so when I was hiring FP&A, for example, it would be ignoring just a series of interviews and processes and people that you meet, but a specific FP&A task for a problem in the business. And so this might be, for example, a market sizing task, or it could be investment appraisal. So we are looking at, we want to acquire venue XYZ or company XYZ. Here's some broad his balance sheet, P&L, cash flow. Can you appraise it for me? Can you figure out what works or what doesn't work? Throw in a few mistakes in there that would hope that they would ask. If not a problem. But again, just kind of methodology of thought. Process, I think, is important here, is because for companies at our stage, A, B, C, D, and plus, if you're an FP&A, you're not just an FP&A, you're going to have hundreds of other people. You're going to have a sales team coming to you asking questions. You're going to have the operations team. If I'm not around, you're going to have the legal team. So for them to have contact time with, I think, a lot of the stakeholders that they'll be working with, and everyone does this anyway, for them to have contact time with all of these stakeholders through the interview process is super, super important. And then more, you know, it's such a standard thing to do, but I think it's just very conscious not to fall into the trap of you work in the finance team, your finance at this stage. Actually, you work in the finance team, but you're going to be across so many desks.
Yeah, I like that actually, that you also involved other people in the stages of the interview. I'll be curious to understand, because actually, like you said, like that's a really great impression for the candidate as well, because they're like, great, like, you know, like I'm not going to be siloed. I actually really genuinely get to business partner. And I guess great from the employees as well, like, you know, the legal team was like, you know, this is great because I'm involved in that decision process. what are they? I'll be curious to understand like how do you evaluating? Is it more just a cultural fit more than anything else, rather than the technical kind of understanding, a technical test, I guess?
Yeah, in terms of technical capabilities, technical assessment, I always kept like it as my domain. Let me assess you technically. Let me see how you work with the team technically. Even sometimes with a product manager, if they're going to be working closely with product team, because as a finance team, I feel like it's important that you work closely with product as well, especially if you're releasing sort of fan-facing product features. But that's a separate thing. So technical assessment definitely belongs in finance. Culture fit and especially culture add. Throw them across all different stakeholders in the business and let them speak to your ops heads, your GCs, definitely your sales team, always your sales team, and the CEO, of course, CEO founders, of course.
Yeah, no, definitely. Roshni, is that something that you do in your company as well, where the finance team also speaks to other people?
Yeah, we have it actually as a general HR process that basically, obviously, you have an interview, even if you're like a software developer or whatever it is, you have it obviously with your line manager. But then you have a team fit where you have to speak to somebody who's basically, you know, not in that specific that you're at. So we always do, like at the previous one's finance, like sit down with sales, definitely, because that's where a lot of your basically interactions are. And yeah, it's what Taz says about a team fit. Do they think that you're going to be one of those finance people that just basically says no all the time, that you're just really interested in the numbers, or you're actually there to basically help them? Yeah, so I think that's a really good point, and we do that currently. Like I said, with everybody, you just have to make sure, especially within startups, right? It's like you're going to talk to everybody, sort of thing. So it's not a big corporate, so everyone kind of has to fit in and be like, yeah, actually, this person is going to fit into our team, our culture, as well as do their day-to-day job.
And in terms of like evaluating a CV as well, like what are you looking for? How do you go, or is that something that HR does, I guess, and you have less visibility on? Because I'd be quite keen as well, like, you know, like when you look at someone's background, how do you decide, yeah, I'm speaking to this person, or no, not a good fit?
Yeah, I think with the CV, it's just like if you look at a bunch of CVs, you can look at one CV and be like, actually, this doesn't really sound interesting at all. But actually, if somebody's written their CV properly, you're just like, oh, actually, this key things that make sense. If they've you know, definitely if they've worked in a smaller company before, I'm like, oh, yeah, they'd be really interesting to sort of work for. I think what Taz mentioned earlier, but also I think, Julie, you mentioned this in the first panel that you did. I think there's that whole thing about there were a couple of panelists who were like, yeah, we want ACA sort of thing. And we were just like, well, I thought, well, it doesn't really matter where you've got it from. It's, you know, if you're an accountant and you can do the job, yeah, it basically doesn't really matter for that. So I think CVs are super hard to kind of look at unless it's basically something that, like, yeah, something stands out that seems wrong or something that sounds amazing.
Yeah, definitely. And Julie, what do you think? Because yeah, I definitely agree that, like, I think AC is one of those heuristics. Like, I mean, I've seen so many job ads. I mean, a lot of job ads are like copies of like other job ads, right? And it always, I've seen so many where it's like, oh, 3 to 5 years post-qualified experience. But like, what does that even mean? Like, you know, like why does ACA, and sometimes I've seen like job ads as well with like CIMA preferred. I was like, oh, hold on there. So like, if I've got the ACA, does that not mean anything? If I've got it from, like, I guess in your instance, you've got your CPA, I guess, in Australia. So like, oh, does that not count? So like, how do you, but then without a heuristic, what else are you looking for?
So I think at the CV stage, it's almost a bit of a checkbox, right? Like if there's anything that you really need to have from the person, so the qualification or the industry or particular projects or systems that they've done, then you can use a CV more of a checklist. What I've always done as well is to have those open questions, which I think a lot of startups do as well. So, you know, asking 2 or 3 experience-based questions that are open text and then seeing how the person responds. So they can be semi-technical, obviously not super technical because potentially it might be a HR recruiter who's reviewing and not yourself. But I think it actually, those influence me more than the CV because you look at, you know, how did they answer it? What level of detail did they get into? How did they resolve? Like if you're asking, you know, tell us about the most complex X kind of problem you've had. You know, you'll get people that give you a one-liner and it's like, okay, that's probably not great. Someone who gives you, 10-page essay, also too much. So like looking at the responses that they give you, how did they describe the problem? How did they resolve it? And is it articulated well? Do you understand what they're talking about? I think those open questions, having 2 or 3 of them, are actually more useful than the CV. And then you also kind of see like who can be bothered to fill them out, right? It's a level of effort as well. So how much thought did they put into it?
Yeah, I definitely like that, because I definitely think as well, like CVs are obviously flawed, I guess, like as much as it's a necessity, I guess. Obviously you want to have a quick check of people's backgrounds, but obviously like it's hard to predict, you know, like their performance, like based on the CV. It's just so hard. And I think Taz, you mentioned this, right? Like you want to hire beyond your experience really, but like obviously to find that at that stage is obviously quite difficult. Do you have any technical tests, Julie, that you do for your team?
Yeah, so we always do the technical tests. I try to do them in a way that the person shouldn't spend more than sort of 2 to 3 hours. So typically for me anyways, I structure in a way where there's a semi-technical element. So it's just a quick test of Excel skills as well. And like Taz said, kind of maybe throw in a couple of mistakes and see who picks up on them. And then a few questions that are more analytical. And then what I tend to do as well is if their assignment is generally good, then the next interview is a discussion with myself, you know, people in the team, and it's partly reviewing the assignment. So getting understanding of what their assumptions were, what their thought process was, like why they answered in particular ways, and then being able to ask follow-on questions. So, you know, if they came to particular analysis, obviously it's based on the limited information they have. So if you throw extra information at them, give them another dimension to look at, give them more specifics about the business, how do they take that information, use it, like understand it, and then develop their opinion or develop their response further. So I found that's helpful,
Yeah,
like the technical bit, and also just seeing how they deal with stress situations and interpreting information quickly.
Yeah, no, definitely. I do quite like the fact that you actually get people to write responses. Like in fact, like not a cover letter, but like, you know, but make an effort at the start. Because in fact, like that's how we do it as well, because I prefer to judge people based on those responses and then I check their CV. Because otherwise, if you just check someone's CV, it's just so hard. It's just so hard to kind of get that information. Cool. Okay, great. Before I kind of conscious of time, we've got about 6 minutes or so. And before we kind of wrap up, really, one of the questions that came up was around like, how do you set up the team for success, the finance team for success? So as an ops person, you've hired your first finance hire. How do you make sure that, you know, that they have everything that they need to excel at their role? So I'll be quite keen to hear as like, you know, what, from your experience, what have been your main blockers? And also I think just, not just generally with you, maybe not the ops team, but also with the wider team as well. Again, like I think you've both mentioned it, Taz and Roshni, about the sales and finance interplay. Like I've just seen that happen so many times, that friction between the two. So Taz, like why don't you kind of start us with like how, from an ops person's perspective, any tips for them to make sure when finance, like, you know, like the finance team comes in, like they're going to be all good to go?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. It's kind of a tough one actually, depending on how good a condition the ops person managed to get things in prior to the sort of finance person coming in. But I think it's very difficult for anyone to come in with a cold start, especially in finance when you're learning, because you're going to be learning many different functions, many different disciplines of a new business early. So I think if you're the ops person, if you're the incumbent ops person, please be sensitive to our very boring and annoying questions that will seem very stupid. But crucially, I think the time is the most important thing. Beyond the look, if we just move away from the finance bit, like yes, we'd hope that there's maybe like a financial model in place and zero something makes a little bit of sense. And if there are external accountants, can we get some airtime or like airtime now, I guess, some airtime with them. But also just sort of this, I think just some sensitivity from the rest of the business that finance is going to be spending a lot of time with sales. So we'd hope that sales can commit some time to educating and like, how are you using Salesforce? How are you using Pipedrive? These sorts of things. Same with the ops, same with legal. It would be my ask basically. And just some idea of how things are stored and saved.
Yeah, I think I definitely agree with that one, like just basically giving finance a bit of time. And I think just to add to that, just being open as well. Like it's fine, like we do not expect things to be perfect. So just being open if like things aren't, because like I've been in a few situations where like I wasn't told about it and I had to find that out. I would have much preferred if you told me that it wasn't working before finding it out, because there's also that loss of trust as well, because I'm like, oh, if this is not working, is there like a bunch of other things that's not working?
Yeah, can I just add, I guess, because I think at any level really, whenever the finance person comes in, let's say from sort of management accounting up, they're going to be very, very good at spotting problems, but that I don't want that like for the ops person, do not feel like that's like a challenge of what you've been doing or anything like that, because everyone's just been moving fast, not thinking about the best way to do it. You've just been thinking of a way to do it. So kind of just be sensitive that the questions aren't there to probe necessarily. They're just, it's a mechanism for the finance person just to learn and get up to speed.
Yeah, no, definitely. Because like, again, like the other annoying perception that you sometimes get is that like finance just says no to everything, it just finds problems and like, you know, is like the blocker for everything, which I don't think is the case. And I think most ops people would be sympathetic to that. I'm sure like a lot of ops people have also faced those acquisitions before, like, why are you here? Like what, like I'm doing it fine, but actually it's not. So I think tasks like definitely like that time and sensitivity, like that space to just like, you know, to figure out what's going on and to ask questions.
And also, if you are the incumbent ops person, just make it very, very clear what you would like. I'm not setting set out scope or demands, but I'm just saying this is what I'm not good at, and this is what I feel like we need, or this is what I am good at, and whatever else. Just be very, very like over communicate everything.
Definitely. And I guess Roshni, given your kind of multiple hat in finance and ops, so what do you think, I guess, like when you first joined, like would have been super beneficial? Like what worked, what didn't work?
I think basically when I started, I'm just like, it's basically what you and Taz have been saying, like complete transparency and honesty, right? To kind of be like, look, and sit down with every single person, I don't know, head of ops, head of sales, head of whoever, to kind of be, look, I'd always be like, look, I'm not being nosy or trying to kind of like, you know, I just kind of need to know what kind of the lay of the land is at the moment. What can I do to help you? I think that always helps with salespeople to be like, look, you know, tell me what you need from me. What are you getting right now that needs an improvement? That's always sort of helping. And I think it just does come down to what, Taz said, is like spend time as a finance person and as part of the business to make time with whoever it is to sit down for half an hour to kind of figure out what's what and be completely transparent. And then it can only get better from there, right?
Yeah, no, definitely. And I guess like Julie as well, like you're also wearing that dual hat as well of finance and ops. So like when you joined like WeGift like not too long ago, I guess, like what do you think worked really well and what do you think could have been a bit better?
So I think, yeah, same thing in terms of making sure the person has time to spend with all the different teams and understands what they do, understands the business, and then can pull the picture together. So that helps them as well. Like just when they're looking at the expenses, for example, they can tie, you know, 2 and 2. So, you know, it's not just a lot of money that's being spent. It's like, this is what the team is using it for. This is a value that a particular software, particular consultant brings to the team, and helps the person develop not just a financial understanding, but the value of everything happening in the company. So I think that's important. The transparency as well. And I think what's probably important in a lot of roles is in that first month, you're learning the business, you're learning the processes, you're figuring out what has and hasn't happened to date. And then helping them maybe whatever the right time frame is, like 30 or 60 days later, review everything they've learned and then figure out what the priorities are. Because for example, you don't want them reacting to sort of the first fire that they walk into, but it might not be the biggest fire. Yeah, so I think letting the person absorb everything and then make a decision on what the priorities are to focus on is really important. So I guess on that note, from the company side or, you know, the ops manager side, not throwing at them what you think is necessarily the biggest issue, like give them your recommendation probably, but letting them figure out or letting them assess if that really is the biggest issue or not, because they might see another problem that you haven't seen yet.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point actually, because like the biggest fires might not be the most important fires. They might be like, I guess if I keep using the fire analogy, like hidden fires, I guess, where it might even be worse. And that's kind of what you said earlier before about risk as well. Like the role of the finance team is to identify those risks that you yourself haven't yet identified, because you just haven't had the experience of working in that line, I suppose. So I think definitely that's quite a key one. And about giving And I think kind of if I summarize, I guess, all your thoughts here, it's about making sure you give the team, like the finance hire, the space to speak to everyone, understand what's going on. Don't be too sensitive. We ask lots of questions and we point things out that's not working. It's because we want what's best for the company. And then I think going back to what you said, Julie, about actually don't just get the finance team to like solve the loudest person's problems, but let them figure out like what those priorities are. Obviously, we'll obviously like be heeding, like we'll obviously be keen to get recommendations, but at the same time, once we've done this sort of like kind of discovery stage ourselves, like we would be a much better place to figure out for ourselves like what is the priority and what isn't quite the priority. Okay, great. Time for questions. Cool. So thanks very much. That was sort of my questions, I suppose. And like I thought what would be quite good as well. I think there's a few Q&As as well on the Q&A kind of sidebar, I suppose. So I'll start. What I'll do is I'll read the kind of I'll read the questions and then I'll ask one of you to jump in. So Sharon has asked, like, when you go from outsourcing your finance function to bringing your first finance hire in, how should the work that the finance function is carrying out change? What are the things that the finance person should start doing that wasn't being done before? Who would like to tackle this one? Tas, do you want to have a go?
Sure, I can have a go. So I think sorry, I'm just going to pull it up also. So what are the things that the finance person should start doing that wasn't being done before? I think that becomes very, very, I think that's actually a lot easier than you think it would be. If we imagine that the externals were doing payroll and making the management accounts, then you can imagine that the incumbent finance hire very early is going to be building on top of that. First bringing it in and then doing it, but adding all of the commercial, basically adding all of the commercials around that, making it sense, being able to talk about that. I don't imagine the externals can stand up at an all hands and tell your company about what happened last week, the biggest events, the biggest this, who the biggest accounts are, all these sorts of things. It may not be your finance team that does that, but these are the sort of areas that the finance function can start doing that the externals won't be doing. Also questions from the other team. So if you're an ops leader, how often are you going to go to your external accountants and ask them about, I don't know, maybe a certain account that is overdue or something like that. But you will start doing that with your in-house finance team. So small things I think you'll start seeing very, very early actually.
Yeah, I guess what you said about like depends, I guess it also depends, right, on like very much what the team, the outsourced kind of accountants are doing, I suppose. Because if they're doing the payroll, it may make sense for them to keep doing the payroll. Because like, I mean, payroll's again a very commoditized area where like, does the in-house, like the new finance hire need to do it? But I think what you said about commercials is probably the most important one, because like the finance hire will obviously be a hire that will be full-time in the business, which just means that they obviously have a lot more context about the business and all that sort of thing. Cool. Julie, what do you think?
I think very similar, sort of like adding that more customized element to the piece of work. So besides the commercials, I'd also have the person start thinking about how do they integrate with any other systems, or like how do you pull information from any other systems or work with other teams so that you can make the processes more customized to your business, and ideally start getting them in the habit of thinking of how to scale. So, you know, you're no longer like a standalone finance function external where things are being sent, I don't know, via email back and forth or something, right? Like you're actually in the business, so how do you leverage that and then build the processes around it that's efficient as well. And I think besides the commercial side again, well, hopefully there is someone doing this, but thinking about like the runway and the cash management, like how do you optimize your cash? Not sure if you would be doing that if your financials are external, but probably important to get that in with the first person.
Yeah, no doubt, definitely. And Roshni, do you have anything else to add to that?
No, totally. I think the cash flow for me, when you said that, Julie, I was like super important, because I just don't think that, yeah, any outside accountants are going to do that for you. They won't take the risks.
Yeah, no, definitely. Cool. Moving on to the next question, specifically around like, so I think we talked about this, like the first hire should be a generalist. So Ian's just wondering as well, like given that generalists would have very different profiles, which areas within generalism? I mean, basically he's asking like, what areas would you prioritize? In effect, asking like what specialist skills are you looking for, I suppose? So what would you prioritize? Yes, I think we agree that definitely you want someone who wants to get their hands dirty, who has a broad sense of things that are going on. I think we agree that the first hire is definitely not someone who specializes in property tax, you know, but generally speaking, it's probably a broad area of like accounting and SME, I guess. But Judy, what do you think?
Yeah, so I think not necessarily using the qualification itself as a requirement, but someone who has general financial accounting, management reporting experience. And so yeah, like tax is quite specialist, like regulatory reporting is quite specialist. So those are probably areas that you won't want or won't need on day one. Yeah. Yeah, so something around sort of the accounting, I guess in an ideal sense, someone who's also had analytical, so has done FP&A or business partnering, so they do know how to tie in the business picture and talk to other stakeholders in the company as well.
Yeah, definitely. Roshni, what's your view on this?
Yeah, somebody who, you know, can do your a step up from the management accounts, so actually providing like variance analysis, right? Again, making some numbers mean something that your CEO is like, actually, yeah, this sort of makes sense to me. So yeah, definitely has an accounting sort of background and can pull together useful information.
And Tas, what's your view on this?
My view is actually exactly the same as Julie and Roshni. But Juma, can I just, I think one thing I would say, and Julie made a really, really good point earlier on the first question, which kind of, I think, can fit into this also, is what Julie mentioned about like systems and processes in terms of kind of what the finance hire will do. Like today, especially in the businesses that we work in, the finance, certainly like senior finance hires, you have to be a bit of a systems architect. You've got to be a bit of a product guy or girl, and you really have to know these things. So I think having that in your finance team for the ops teams, having that in your finance team, start patching together everything that's going on in the business, will really, really make a huge difference versus the externals when your like sales teams start interacting with you more and your ops team start interacting with you more, and your product team. I think that will be that's game changing from what the externals cannot do to what the internals can do. Like that stuff will just elevate the whole business. You start becoming like, you start scoring points rather than just sort of keeping track of the score.
I know, I think that's definitely the key point here. I think sometimes like working, because I found that when I was, you know, the transition from like working from a corporate to a startup, like I definitely, you know, again in the corporate, like you have systems that are like, let's just face it, like aren't great, but like, you know, there's no, it is all very kind of simple. And you don't, I mean, basically the biggest system that you use day to day is Excel. Let's face it, there's nothing else, right? Whereas in a startup, suddenly it's not just Excel. There's like, you know, like fine, Google Sheets, but there's like a bunch of other software, like a bunch of CRMs that you then have to integrate into your accounting system. So I think going back to what Tas said is like, you obviously want someone who has like a solid accounting background of like just basically understanding what debits and credits are, knowing what a P&L is, and not like super literate, like super numerate, sorry, that was what I meant, rather than literate, and being comfortable with numbers and making those analysis, obviously being comfortable on Excel or on a spreadsheet anyway. And then on top of that as well, making sure that they understand that it's not just about the accounting, because then you also have people who are very much like, from our experience, are just like, that care a lot about accounting treatments, but actually there's very little advantage commercially about, you know, how you account for debt versus like a loan versus debt versus equity. It's great to get it right, but like, you know, sales isn't going to care about that. Sales just wants to know what's my revenue numbers, and to get those revenue numbers, like Charles, what you said, like how do you bring all those systems into place so that like your Salesforce number is actually the same as what gets reported to the board, as what's in Xero, and everyone's looking at it and understand that revenue means this and not something else. Because yeah, that's definitely maybe that systems plus obviously core basic accounting, if I had to sum it, is probably the right fit. Cool. I think we have one question here around who was the unlikeliest internal ally when growing the finance team, and who did you butt heads with? So the example given was like, sales was great because a great ally because they were quite keen for like, you know, finance to come in to basically make sense of all the numbers, to align everyone on revenue numbers. but who in your team? This feels like a bit like bad-mouthing other teams, I guess, but we'll give it a shot. But who do you feel, which teams, I guess, Jenny, do you feel like are always kind of like loggerheads, I guess, with finance? If anyone wants to offer an answer. Taz, are you going for it?
I'm going to go for it, and I'm going to give. So when I say, okay, so unlikeliest ally, product. The whole development team were so open and enthusiastic. I'd go to them with insane requests, like I want to re-platform the whole payments architecture, and I'm like, okay, let's do it. And we'd carve out time in sprints, or like we need to completely redesign our fee builder, or like how we recognize revenue based off of the thousands of different fees that are applicable across different countries. Okay, let's do it. We need to re-architect how we do refunds and how that surfaces in the app. Okay, let's do it. So product were very enthusiastic. In my experience, I'm always like very happy to always work with finance in building really cool features for internal and external. And then I think always butting heads with probably people who are very interested in, I won't say which teams specifically, but anything commissions based can be a little bit, because there's always a conversation of why this number, why not that number, why is, and then you're asking, well, you made this deal and you promised a forecast, I don't know, an 18-month forecast of X or Y when you brought it to us. It's now underwater. What are you doing about it? This is you financing it to the sales team, and then they're well, you know, I don't have X, Y, Z. It's like, okay, everyone's just very good at spotting problems, and certainly the commissions teams. But that's it. I'm gonna leave before anyone else.
I agree with the commissions, definitely. It's always a very sensitive topic, but I also agree with the product actually, because I think product's very keen as well, because they recognize that they don't have the kind of specialist knowledge in the area and don't necessarily understand the kind of flows as well. So again, like product has always been in my kind of previous roles as well. Product's always been very happy to come to me before like I raise it as a problem. They're like, oh, like we're building this thing, better let finance know, which is great. Like what you don't want is like finance to find out 6 months later, like, oh, you're doing this thing? How did you think we were gonna like, you know, actually reconcile this back to bank? So that, and you're right, like that's great. Although at the early stages, that might not be the case. I think once they've seen finance, I think this is it, like once they've seen finance come and help them unblock a few things, then like it's suddenly like, oh, finance can really help with that. So Julie, have you got your, I guess, friends and foes?
Yeah, I mean, I guess to be cliched, it's always down to the people, right, as rather than the function.
Of course.
Yeah. I guess on the commission side, we're B2B at WeGift here, so the number of clients is not that high, but what we've actually done on the commission side is only pay commissions once the client actually pays us. So it forces our salespeople to make sure they get good clients, not just sign contracts. Yeah, yes. And that's helped keep things pretty like uncontroversial, I guess. Yeah, but yeah, I think product definitely is a good ally because engineers like to build things, they like to automate and solve problems. So when you see all the shit that finance and ops has to deal with downstream from the growth side, like you'll always find some engineers that want to come in and help you and help solve and automate and clean things up. So I find that's always really useful, obviously important to build those relationships. Yeah. On the butt heads with, yeah, I think it just comes down to the person, but ultimately it's the people who don't see finance as value add. Like I said, that traditional view of finance as a cost center and, oh, you're just kind of annoying me and you'll say no to me, and people who, you know, you have to kind of go out of your way to prove to them that you can help them build their function or add value to the company.
Yeah, definitely. And I think at the end of the day, there's always going to be that tension as well, because like, you know, like sales, obviously, generally speaking as well, I think we always find that like finance is a little bit more, not pessimistic, but like just more pragmatic. Whereas like sales and marketing is always like the world's ours type thing. But I think that healthy tension is required because like, you know, both aren't right, I don't think. Like finance shouldn't be that pragmatic, well, or that pessimistic anyway. And obviously sales shouldn't be that crazy because like finance need to plan for this eventuality when we're going to run out of money. Sales don't kind of need to do that, right? So we're always thinking the worst because we're like, what are we going to do if we actually run out, right? So what about you, Roshni? What's your take on this?
I mean, it's exactly the same as Taz and Julie. So I think, I mean, it didn't help that the first startup I went into, obviously the first finance hire, and I changed their sales bonus scheme. So they were definitely not my ally. But it is even the same, not even at startup. I'll just quickly go back to Universal. Sales were always sort of there, just like what you were saying, Juven. It's just, they're obviously, their bonuses are on their sales, right? And you sort of try to change it and be like, actually, yep, we're only going to pay you when the client pays. They'd never had that before, or sometimes they'd get paid bonuses and commissions based like, yeah, not taking into consideration like returns or anything like that. So yeah, it's the same sort of thing. And like currently my engineering team are great. Like they literally, I think they're on the cautious side. Anything that they kind of think would affect cash or finance or anything, they're just like always on the phone being like, oh, we changed our bill of materials to do this, or we think we're going to have a delay, so this is how it's going to affect our cash flow. So yeah, same sort of thing.
Yeah, and I think the other thing I would add to this, again, like it's also very much like it's quite top down as well, because where I find that where it's been really difficult is when you have like the management team themselves thinking that finance is a cost center. So if you have a CMO, a CEO, any of the C levels, I guess, thinking that like, yeah, whatever, finance, I mean, like they're just processing shit, right? And then that view flows through to everyone else. So like, and if it's the opposite, whereby like sales is like, yep, like the CRO is like, we need obviously finance support, like their support here, because they're the ones, making sure the systems all tie in, that like, we're like actually presenting like a coherent like number to the board or whatever it is, then everything, it just flows through as well to the rest of the team as well. So it is, yeah, just like I said, like I've worked with startups before where like finance was brought in way too late. So it was like, so you already know that the mentality of the management team wasn't finance, it was like sales, marketing, then developers, so that's also where I would say is probably, from my experience, like can be quite tricky for sure. And I guess one final question to end with, just a quick fire one. What would you say is the number one thing to not do when hiring? So who would like to kick this one off? Go for it, Taz.
Don't hire anybody that's similar to you.
Good advice, good advice. And Julie, what do you think?
Yeah, that was a good one. I think what we said earlier as well, like don't hire specifically for a CV or a technical experience. It's so much more about the attitude and the ability of the person to get stuck into something.
And Roshni?
Yeah, I'd say don't go for somebody, who does have like loads of years experience and you think they're a little bit of a superstar. I think it's better with a startup to kind of be like somebody who's like, on their way to becoming something like great.
Yeah, no, definitely. So I think that's all quite good advice, definitely. So on that note, like I hope that everyone's kind of enjoyed the session. Thanks for kind of giving up your Wednesday evening. So before, I guess, just to wrap up, I'll pass this back to Ozrina, who I guess would let us know what next.
So actually, I'm going to pick up from here.
Oh, great.
Thank
no
you
worries.
so much to Julie, Roshni, and Taz. That was so fascinating. It gives me a whole new appreciation for my finance team. Thank God I have one at my company, Lantum. So no, it was just so insightful, and I feel like I learned a lot, and it's given me a lot of food for thought as I think about hiring. And then thank you so much, Juven, for doing a great job of moderating. So interactive. As Ozrina said, this was sadly the last in our Finance for Ops series, but rest assured there is a lot more great content to come. So there's a number of channels where you can reach us. So we have a mailing list, which you can access on our website, which is www.operationsnation.com. You can follow us on LinkedIn if you haven't already. Follow us on Eventbrite if you're just more interested in events like this. If you missed any of the other Finance for Ops events, you can find all the recordings on YouTube. So please subscribe to our channel. And finally, if you have anything at all you want to say, if you have ideas for future events, content that you would like to share as an ops leader, anything at all, please don't hesitate to email us at hello@operationsnation.com. So thank you again to everyone. We know it is getting late in the evening, so we will let you go. But thank you again to our amazing panelists, our amazing moderator, and thank you to all of you guys for making this such a great event. Have a great night.